My task is to compare and relate the thinking on united action in the era of Lenin's Communist International in the 1920s with the situation today. And Kate is going to then try to situate us in the present and examine what is it that we face today. Now, as you learned in the last session, I've been involved for some years in publishing documents of the Communist International in English. And I set a limit at Lenin's time. That is, my work has not gone beyond the death of Lenin at the beginning of 1924. So just taking those first 5 years of what you may call Lenin's Comintern, I find that there are really two themes and thrusts in this work that are a bit different. Initially, the emphasis is on the fact that communists must split from reformists, organize in revolutionary parties, and lead workers in an all-out assault on capitalism with the perspective of carrying out socialist revolution across Europe with the perspective of a couple of years. But also, somewhat at the same time, but increasingly after the first year of the Communist International, the Comintern, as they called it, was girding for an extended struggle for hegemony in workers' movements, including through alliances in struggle with reformist forces. If you want, these two moments of the Comintern could be referred to as a war of movement and a war of position. Now, this comparison, war of movement, war of position, you have probably heard before, and I think most of you know who was the first person who popularized it. And of course, you're right, it was Bohumil Šmeral, the leader of the Czechoslovak communists in 1921. And it caused an immense uproar in the communist movement. He was almost expelled for it, but it later became famous in another formulation. So the emphasis was, in the first moment, more on the Revolutionary Party, and the second moment, more on the United Front. Now, one thing that I find paradoxical is that the socialists of my generation, when they look back on the Comintern era, they tend to focus more on the first moment rather than on the second. That is, the focus is more on the Revolutionary Party, the crisis of leadership, the need to prepare ourselves for the seizure of power, rather than on the war of position and all that entails. I would like to take as an example of this a very excellent book on the Comintern by Duncan Hollis. Now, which I recommend to you, and there's a lot. I have learned a lot from it. But I notice one of its good points is that he's critical of the Communist International in many areas. And where are some of the areas that he is critical? Well, he doesn't really buy the idea of supporting revolutionary nationalist movements. His analysis of the United Front is extremely one-sided. He leaves out transitional demands entirely, and he doesn't like the idea of workers' governments. Well, these are four central pillars of the war of position, if you will. And so I think in revisiting the Communist International, we've got to beware on this and try to, why did they pay so much attention to cooperatives, for example? They kept talking about cooperatives. Why did they invest so much in that? We have to think that through. Why did they set up a separate organization to conduct communist revolutionary work among women? You know, why did they feel that that was deserving of such emphasis? Now, what were the Comintern policies for a war of position? Well, here there's a danger of doing a catalog, so I'll do a quick catalog. It embraced these fields, among others. Basically, the concept of workplace and community, unions and cooperatives. The question of formal political engagement, mass workers' parties, parliamentary elections, things of that sort. Questions of oppression by imperialism, which involve colonial liberation and also solidarity here in the heartlands. Questions of the search for allies among non-proletarian forces, alliances with peasants, with women, the defense of young workers. And democratic rights. a key weak point of Lenin's International, which is interesting because Lenin himself was so strong on democratic rights, if you take his career as a whole, his writings as a whole. But it did come up around defense of political prisoners and anti-fascist unity. But let us not be weak on that point, because sometimes we try to mimic the weaknesses of the Communist International as well as its strengths. And workers' unity and struggle, which is more the province of the last talk I gave, where I talked of the United Front, transitional demands, and workers' governments as a triad that together embrace the concept of unity in action. Now, all these elements I just enumerated were Bolshevik policy in 1917, but partly because Europe was not a czarist dictatorship. The conditions were so different. The communists of Lenin's time tended to learn more from the actions in Europe rather than from the record of the Bolsheviks. Lenin was rather the only one who kept saying the Russian experiences are crucial, you must study them. But I don't think they were studied that much. Well, that's perhaps debatable. But in any case, the areas that I've covered, they are several high points of a socialist program today, although we would add more. Ecology, an area where the Bolsheviks were rather strong, was not an area of concern for the Communist International, a weakness which we do not intend to imitate. Now, all of these were applications of an underlying strategy which was summed up by the Comintern in 1921 as "to the masses," which means join with working people in their daily struggles, whatever they are. The basis of unity is support for the immediate demands. We do not ask more. We do not demand agreement on the final goal and the road toward it. Another point was cede control to the united and democratic leadership bodies of alliances for action. Do not impose the decisions and discipline of your own organization. Accept the discipline of the United Front. Another was freedom of criticism. Boldly put forward your own point of view, hopefully with a sense of perspective, along the lines of revolutionary education and building a revolutionary movement. And finally, revolution as the act not of communists, but revolution as the act of the vast majority. However, that was the fundament of the United Front policy of the Communist International. But there was an ambiguity in it. Because you see, what the Communist International did is they took the United Front policy developed in action by the mass movement and then linked it to their strategy of building communist parties, which was not part of the original article. You see, it was something they did because they were convinced that the communist parties were essential to the triumph of the revolution, and that introduced an ambiguity. The ambiguity was brought out by a notorious statement by a French communist leader, Albert Train, which was much used by the reformists at the time. He said, the United Front is a way to pluck the chicken. That is to pluck the socialist parties, to pluck off their members, to pluck off their support and strengthen their own movement. Well, what is it? I mean, for the communists of the day, it was both. That the United Front was both to build the Communist Party and to build the mass movement. But which took priority? You see, that's simply, read the book on the Fourth Congress and you'll see, it is simply not clear. And you can see that some comrades are pulling in one direction and some in the other. If you read what is said by Gregory Zinoviev or Nikolai Bukharin or Bela Kun, for example, the emphasis is strongly on building the party as the purpose of the United Front. If you read what Clara Zetkin says, or Karl Radek, or Lenin, it's strongly on building the mass movement. It's not that simple, it's not always that clear, but that's the tendency, you see. I'll get back to this question of where to put the emphasis in a moment. Now, I had a section here on transitional demands, which I think I'm going to pretty much leave out because it was well covered in the last section. And my chair here wants me to be brief. Now, today's conditions are so totally different. What are we to make of this? How are we to apply this concept to today's conditions? They were talking about a duality of the Revolutionary Party and their revolutionary parties. I mean, if it had only 50,000 members, they called it a sect. You know? These were substantial parties with the support of hundreds of thousands of millions of workers. on the one side. On the other, a working class in which the majority of the workers were socially conscious, had class consciousness, and in their millions were socialists. Perhaps not sure how to achieve socialism, but who had internalized that goal. We don't have either the one or the other. We don't have a mass socialist working class, and we don't have revolutionary parties either. And let's not kid ourselves. What we have built with such great effort, the socialist organizations that exist, proud and effective as they are in their way, these are not revolutionary parties. These are fragments of a notional revolutionary party if they can ever find their way together with each other and with all of the other activists coming into motion. As for the mass workers' parties, well, I guess they exist, but they are vastly changed, and I would say in general not as big a factor as they were in the past because of the decline of class consciousness within them. So what are the two elements of the duality? I would say on the one hand, the more conscious element is the community of anti-capitalist activists, some of whom are organized in groups, some of whom are independent, who are striving together to build, consciously, to build an anti-capitalist movement. That's the vanguard element, if you will, those who are in the lead. And the broader movement is the social movements as a whole. You see? And so when we think of the duality of party and masses, it's now more the duality of anti-capitalist activists and the social movements which they strive to build and in which they're active. At least that's how it's appeared to me in my experience. Perhaps it's different here. And another thing we find out is that when we build united alliances for action, we find generally that socialist groups are working at a disadvantage. That often they are not really involved, and often they sort of limp in such a coalition. That socialist groups often tend to think of a united front more as something they do with their friends and that they control, rather than a milieu where they're a very small factor, they don't have too much influence, and by the way, they would be well advised not to caucus before meetings because you simply cannot predict what the decisions of a meeting ought to be, and if you try to impose decisions made from outside, you are finished. You will just not be listened to. At least in Toronto. At least in Toronto, where I come from, we are seeing united fronts without organized socialist groups. And that's an interesting tendency, which we should sort of think about what that means. And in that context, I'd like to say something about how transitional demands sometimes come up within that framework. Suzanne and I participated 6 months ago in forming a group in Toronto who it was said to be eco-socialist. That was more our intention, but the group itself is non-partisan. It isn't even of the left. It's a group of everybody. It's got people who are pro-capitalist, who are part of the capitalist bourgeois parties as well as the Social Democrats, people with every kind of motivation in it. And in this, we strive to put forward a transitional policy. And how do we do it? It grows naturally out of the situation. We do all kinds of door-to-door work. And what do we say? We've got to stop this tar sands pipeline going through Toronto. And what people ask us? They say, what's the alternative to the tar sands pipeline? Well, there's our opening. There's our opening. What is the alternative? Just to phase out the tar sands? We know we had to send 2 speakers to a conference recently on what we were doing. And one of them we chose was someone whose specialty is care of small children. She talked about how the care of small children is related to the climate change crisis. Think about it, you see, because it gives us this opportunity to start off with the most simple, immediate question and get right into a discussion of the most vast issues of the future, which you could summarize under the concept system change, not climate change. So that's an attempt to answer the question of the previous session about how transitional demands apply in our era. Okay, I've been asked to wrap up. Okay, so I think I can pretty much leave it there. So but I think that you see what we face is that the thoughts of the workers' movement over the decades around united action and the way United Action has to be carried out has to be continued today. Absolutely, and it's necessary to study the record of the past in order to learn from this. But it is in different circumstances, and these different circumstances mean it works out differently in practice. But one thing we must know, and we must learn from the past history, is that the principle of United Front work always must be the movement comes first.